Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to PsychoBible, babbling about psychology and theology. This is part 2 to my response to Christian critics of ex-gay ministry, also known as transformational or redemptive ministry, or therapy efforts to explore sexual attraction change or sexual orientation change. We got a lot of different names for the type of work that I'm involved in and that my friends are involved in. In part 1, I used Becket Cook's commentary on the Netflix documentary Pray Away as a springboard to address criticisms from the, what we call, renounce column. Christians who reject a gay identity and focus on repentance while discouraging counseling for healing of issues underlying the attractions with the, potential hope of seeing the desires and attractions change in some way. So that's the renounce column that Becket Cook and Christopher Yuan and to some extent Jackie Hill Perry, as well as some others, represent. Before I proceed with part 2, I want to make very clear some things I'm not sure I made as clear in part 1. People in the renounce column are against SOCE, or sexual orientation change efforts therapy, or ex-gay ministry because they refuse to see any psychological, emotional, or social basis for the same-sex sexual attractions. As Christopher Yuan says, there's only one cause for same-sex attraction, our sin nature. And so with that said, he discounts anything like the developmental model or trauma-based perspectives, anything that does not attribute the cause directly to sin. Now, to be sure, those of us in the rebuild column who believe in transformational ministry and counseling efforts, we believe that the ultimate root cause is our sinful, fallen nature, yes. But that sin nature is played out in the multiple contributing factors that we observe in the people we work with. Broken homes, abuse, loss, trauma, early sexualization or exposure to pornography, broken and inadequate models of masculinity and femininity, poor attachment and self-image, unhealthy ways of coping with wounds. We see these as all multiple contributing causes. The renounce column makes a false dichotomy between blaming the sin nature and developmental deficits. We see them as both falling under the same umbrella. For example, if I have an anger problem, the experience of anger itself is not a sin. But if it is perpetual, it could give rise for a desire to do something sinful, like act out in violence or rage, slander, or gossip. Now, it could be that I'm just born naturally with an angry disposition. But if you know much about genetics, you know psychological traits and behavioral traits are not so simply caused by genes. So what if my anger is rooted in old, unresolved wounds and trauma? Then I can focus my counseling not just on repentance of sinful actions motivated by anger, but also on healing the underlying wounds. And what if my counseling involves psychological interventions like trauma reprocessing? So there's an analogy that most of us probably don't have a problem with. But for some reason, when it comes to homosexuality, we do. So because the renounce column doesn't accept psychological roots to the attractions, they do not endorse using psychology to address them. This could be because they have a double standard when it comes to this issue. Like I was just saying, I would wager that some in this column would see no problem in using a psychological intervention to help people with anger or depression or drug addiction or OCD. But there are also people in this group that are being consistent across the board with all mental health issues or relational issues because they view the use of the field of psychology as antithetical to Christianity. And they endorse only biblical or nouthetic counseling, which is based on the assertion that everything you will ever need to address any counseling concern is found directly in Scripture. So they would find this passage, the verse, that addresses anger directly and then apply it somehow. This approach to counseling is common in fundamentalist, especially Calvinist, evangelical traditions. So some might actually believe change is possible, but only as a consequence of spiritual discipline or applying a scriptural truth. Or if you're more Calvinist, only by God choosing to make it so, and Him choosing to do so entirely apart from any contribution from the person, since that would then be viewed as synergistic. Generally, though, since the Bible doesn't explicitly delineate a process for addressing same-sex attraction, their biblical counseling approach is going to mostly focus on the same-sex behavior. And so it's going to focus on repentance and abstinence, learning to mature under the hardship of having sinful desires but not giving in to them. So they're going to be very strict in sticking to only what the Scripture says explicitly. So any sort of insight outside of what Scripture says explicitly that might help shed light on where the attractions are coming from, they'll approach with a lot of skepticism at best. The people in the resist column, however, oppose counseling efforts to address same-sex attraction for a different reason. Because they view the intention as just plain ludicrous. Why? Because when it comes to what homosexuality is and how it is caused, they'll default to agreeing with the world, using all of the world's terminology and framework. So being same-sex attracted is just an accident of existence, no different than your hair color. It might not be the way God designed it or wanted it, it might be a consequence of the fall, but just like, say, someone being born with poor eyesight, okay? It's not perfection, but it's just a consequence of living in a fallen world. And that's about the most they'll probably go in investigating the cause. To hope that God will change your sexual attractions, whether by His grace or by counseling to resolve supposed underlying issues, makes as much sense to them as trying counseling to change from black to white. So that's probably why Preston Sprinkle will have a lesbian psychologist like Lisa Diamond, whose research proves sexual attraction is fluid and disproves the born gay and cannot change narrative, though she still toes the ideological line that no one should try to change it. But he hasn't had on a minister from Restored Hope Network or a therapist from the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice who's open to helping people explore their sexual attraction fluidity. Now, I'd hope maybe he will eventually have someone from the Rebuild column, but so far I haven't seen that. However, the people in the Resist column will claim biblical orthodoxy by agreeing with the historic sexual ethic of the church, that marriage is meant for man and woman. So they would call their column Side B, as opposed to the pro-gay affirming Side A, or NASSA, non-affirming same-sex attracted. Therefore, you have gay celibate Christians, like Gregory Coles, or people in what they call mixed orientation marriages. And as far as I know, the only type of counseling that they might endorse would be Yarhouse and Throckmorton's sexual identity therapy framework, which just helps with living congruently with one's commitment to Christian sexual morality. They would say, okay, you're going to place a premium on your Christian identity rather than on your sexual identity. Meanwhile, they have no problem with basing one's sexual identity on one's attractions. If you're primarily attracted to the same sex, then you're gay. Or if a little bit of both, then you're bisexual. It's just what you are. Hence, why they have no problem with saying you're gay, but non-affirming Christian. Now, to be clear, this series I'm doing is not a full critique of these columns. My purpose is rather defensive, to address the attacks from these Christians against those of us who believe in and practice transformational ministry and change-allowing therapy. Again, most of their attacks are based on strawman fallacies, and some are based on conflating our work with that of counselors and ministers who have never aligned with our values and methodologies. For example, a couple reasons why Joe Nicolosi Jr. chose to retire the name Reparative Therapy in 2017, now calling it Reintegrative Therapy, was because the meaning of reparative was being strawmanned to mean that the therapy was about repairing or fixing gay people. It's a dehumanizing misrepresentation that discounts the agency of the individual in counseling and marginalizes healing. Instead, the word reparative is referring to the reparative drive theory introduced by Elizabeth Moberly, the idea that the same-sex erotic desires and attractions emerge as a reparation for gender identity wounds and deficits. Therefore, the therapy addresses these underlying wounds that the client presents. And for years, too many people who were doing counseling for same-sex attraction were calling themselves reparative therapists, even though they were not adequately trained, if at all, in Nicolosi's approach. So, reparative therapy got conflated with, say, a pastoral counselor that might use shaming tactics like confrontation to get the person to repent of using gay porn. Nicolosi would never use that type of approach. Yet someone doing that gets called a reparative therapist. And now what we're seeing is the term conversion therapy being used to group together any sort of counseling approach that does not promote or affirm a gay or lesbian, bi, trans identity. So what would be an accurate understanding of the rebuild column? All right, I want to lay this out there first before I go into the critiques so you can see when they're clearly strawmanning or misrepresenting what we actually believe. The theology that motivates us is that God's original and only design and intent for our sexuality is for the expression of husband and wife to love freely, fully, faithfully, and with openness to life, meaning children. As this is a reflection of who God is and our destiny to participate in the life of the Trinity as the bride of Christ. Sin, though, leads to a disintegration of God's design, both in nature and nurture. Based on the personal experiences of people in this field, and a sound understanding of normative sexual development, or natural law, we tend to find same-sex attraction as a fruit of underlying issues. We don't look at it as the main issue, we see it as a symptom of deeper issues. And the same-sex behavior as unhealthy, sinful attempts at meeting legitimate needs. But the gospel offers not just forgiveness for our sins, but also empowerment to restore us to sexual integrity and wholeness. We understand that this is a process, though, all right? And it varies for each person, and it is not fully complete until the resurrection. We get that. And we understand that change in attractions may be possible to some extent, but that is not necessary for salvation or for freedom from sinful sexual behavior. However, it may aid, coincide, or result from the process. Let me add some more clarification in advance. We don't call what we do conversion therapy because, one, we want to maintain the distinction between religious conversion and inner healing. And two, because we do not promote the idea of categorical change. And that's what the term conversion therapy is connoting. That, oh, you are gay or you are bi and you're going to convert from that to then straight. Like gay to straight. As if it's just like a light switch. We've never taught that. We've always taught that it's more of a dimmer. So, we understand same-sex attraction not as an indicator of what someone is, but as something someone experiences. We understand that LGBT identities are self-labels one uses to embrace the experience. And the reason some of us use the term ex-gay is because most of the early leaders in the movement were former LGBT-identified people. You have to understand that when Exodus was forming in the 70s, it was grassroots and started by actual people leaving homosexual lives. They were literally seeing their gay friends die from AIDS and they cried out to God in desperation. It made sense to say they were ex-gay. But if you ask them today, most of them will say the term has its problems. It's imperfect. It's not an accurate term for people with unwanted same-sex attraction, but never identified as gay. So some will just say that they're someone with unwanted same-sex attraction experiences, or unwanted SSA. I would also add that within the rebuild column, there are some variations. Some believe that it is only through a born-again relationship with Jesus that changes in sexuality may be possible. Some believe that since all truth is God's truth, though, psychological insights and innovations may aid in the process, so long as they are compatible with a biblical worldview. And some believe the best approach is a merger of spiritual and psychological interventions. For example, Living Waters incorporates theology of the body and the developmental model as its framework, and uses worship, confession, and listening prayer as ways of healing memories. Because I personally see same-sex attraction as a social, emotional issue, primarily, I also offer help to non-Christians looking to explore their sexual attraction fluidity back to their normative design. This doesn't save people's souls, okay? I'm not saying that, okay, this is good enough for them, but it respects their autonomy, and it makes sense to help them be restored to sexual wholeness, just as it was Jesus' heart to heal people regardless of their commitment to him. So when we find that, oh, maybe this actually helps people with this issue, why not offer it to everyone, not just to those who have become born again? I do find, though, that my clients who have the clearest and more stable motivation are Christians. So, that's as a side note. So, now with those basics established, let's respond to criticism from the resist column by commenting on Preston Sprinkle's discussion with Tony Scarcello about the Pray Away documentary. As a summary, the resist column in Christianity supports the side B response to homosexuality, which adopts the gay identity but resists the indulgence of same-sex sexual behavior and honors marriage between man and woman as the only biblical practice of sexuality. You will notice that this stance within Christianity has been growing in popularity, especially with big evangelicalism and with intellectuals that want to maintain credibility with the mainstream understanding of the nature of sexual orientation. Their main platform is the Revoice conference that started in 2018, founded by Southern Baptist Theological Seminary graduate Nate Collins, and held at Greg Johnson's PCA Church in St. Louis. Some other big proponents of this column are Preston Sprinkle, of course, and he's a theologian who co-founded the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and he has his Theology in the Raw podcast. Then there's Gregory Coles, who wrote Single Gay Christian, and Wesley Hill, who's most known for his promotion of spiritual friendships, which when you look into it, seems a lot like same-sex marriages without the sex. And in this episode of Preston Sprinkle's Theology in the Raw, he has on Tony Scarcello, a Foursquare gospel pastor who is married but has same-sex attraction to some extent. He claims to have gone through conversion therapy, so he presents himself as like an expert on the topic. Well, by now you should know that if someone uses the term conversion therapy unironically, you should be skeptical about their expertise. So let's jump into this interview.
Long story short, Netflix released a documentary called Pray Away. It addresses, and I would say exposes, the dangers and harm that's been done through so-called ex-gay reparative therapy or conversion therapy practices, mainly through Exodus International, which began...
So right away, they describe the film as exposing the harm of ex-gay ministry. So they already have this assumption that is harmful. And yet, as they keep talking, they'll say that the film doesn't really show much incriminating evidence. So you're seeing right here their own impression, not based on the film, that they already have their own opinions about ex-gay ministry.
The Gospel Coalition wrote an article saying this is very anti-Christian movie,
Yeah.
and so I was honestly caught off guard because I didn't get that from it really at all. Like that it was an anti-Christian movie. Like, I think that, and part of the reason I wanted to reach out to you, I think that it points out problems that a lot of people in the church would agree are problems. I think the solutions it offers is where you and I would disagree with where the movie goes, but the problems it points out, I think most of us can be like, yeah, we agree. That was not good. That was actually bad. So
Right.
You didn't get the impression that this is an anti-Christian movie? Okay, pay attention as we go through the rest of this commentary, and you're going to see why he doesn't get that impression. I'm a little surprised that he lacks some insight here, but let's keep going.
I'm curious, Tony. Did you go through any kind of ex-gay kind of therapy? Like, did this unearth some of your own experiences, or?
Oh, dude, yeah. So we didn't frame it that way when it was happening, but when I kind of shared my story at, excuse me, the church that I was working at the time, and I got let go, they had me see a counselor. And the hope was that after seeing this counselor for a year, I would be reinstated to a leadership position. And it was before the documentary that I realized what was going on there was like a form of reparative therapy. But we would like try and trace back family traumas, try and trace back like any parent issues, and you had a mom who was a drug addict, so maybe that means you just felt safer with men, and then go through like prayers and practices to kind of reconfigure my heart and mind to not be attracted to the same sex anymore. And this actually is maybe a little bit where I take umbrage with the movie, is that it doesn't do a whole lot to tell you exactly why reparative therapy can be damaging. It just assumes that we already know. Like kind of assumes we're all on the same page. This is bad. I have a lot of people in my life who are not on that page, like who still see like a use for it and would advocate for it. And so as I was watching, I was like, yeah, but they're not really doing a lot to talk about how.
So did Tony go through ex-gay counseling? He says yes, even though it wasn't framed that way. Okay, so that doesn't sound like it was an actual Exodus ministry. He calls it a form of reparative therapy. So again, how do you know? But the way he describes it, all right, he says they tried to trace back experiences to find root causes, then use prayers and practices to reconfigure his heart and mind to not be attracted to the same sex anymore. I don't know what that last part means, but it doesn't sound bad yet. It doesn't sound quite like reparative therapy, but sounds more like a ministry approach that has a lot of the influence from the developmental model. But nothing really scandalous in what he's sharing right there. Okay, if we're talking about any other issue that someone could go to counseling for, I would say, all right, sounds like pretty normal Christian counseling. My main question is, was he coerced to do counseling? He says that the church sent him to a therapist, and the plan was that within a year he'd be restored to a leadership position. Okay, but was he coerced? Did he have to? Was this a conditional type of counseling? Was he going willingly? Did he want to go through this whole process? Or was he going there with his arm twisted? That's what I'm trying to figure out. You're an adult at this point. Were you going of your own free will? So that's my main question. Was he there willingly, and was he going with a desire to go through a healing process? All right. In hindsight, the way he's describing it makes it sound like he was subjected to something he didn't want to do. What was his motivation at the time? Was it just so he can get back to ministry? Or was it that he really did want to explore these issues? I'm not so sure, because what he describes next is
like after every session, like you walk away and like I would go throw up in the bathroom stall because like the thoughts that would be running through my mind is like they're trying to like rip something out of me that's never going to come out as much as I want it to. And the visceral like implied message there is that like God made you wrong, so he needs to fix you. And if he doesn't fix you, then it might be a judgment on you, or you're doing something wrong on your part. When really that's, I mean, as Jackie Hill Perry, she says, it's all the sexuality, it's holiness. And so you're trying to like make the solution, everybody needs to be hetero, and maybe if that's not God's ideal for that person or their dream for that person,
Right.
then you're just going to keep hurting them.
He'd throw up after every session. His impression was they were trying to rip something out of him that was just never going to come out. Okay? I'm not sure exactly what he means by that. If he's saying that my SSA is fixed, it's stable, it's immutable, cannot change, and so trying to uncover the root issues is just never going to happen, and they were poking and prodding fruitlessly and hopelessly. Okay, maybe that's what he means. And the way he describes this, the visceral implied message was like God made you wrong. And if he doesn't fix you, it's a judgment against you. That does not sound like any sort of counselor I know in this field. No one would ever say God made you wrong. Okay, right here is a good reminder to use critical thinking when you hear these critics. It's not that he's quoting what they actually said and did. Most of the time, you'll hear a lot of words like, I felt like this, or the implication was this. But they very rarely state what was explicitly said and what the stated goal of therapy was. So it'll be a lot of just what they were feeling, what their impression was, what they felt afterwards, maybe in hindsight. So remember, implied message does not equal explicit message. Now you can say, oh, Andrew, you're just gaslighting. You're just trying to defend these evil, corrupt, terrible therapists and counselors. No, because if there are some therapists out there that I know use some bad techniques, and I would love to identify them and root them out. Like there's some therapists who've used shaming techniques. Yeah, get rid of them. Give me their names. Heck, most of these conversion therapy horror stories you hear are from people who refuse to give the names or they don't remember, like Sam Brinton. And the stuff he describes, I'll be like, yeah, get rid of that therapist. Let's work together to get rid of those types of therapists. Okay? Because I only want good sound counseling and techniques being used. I'm not just for using any and all approach. But I'm also not going to let my colleagues in this field be misrepresented and demonized and used as an excuse to pass more therapy bans.
Yeah, would you say that would be one of the main damaging pieces? Is that until you cultivate heterosexual attractions, there's still something very much off in you as a person.
Okay, so he says, quote, one of the damaging pieces of reparative therapy is the idea that until you cultivate heterosexual attractions, there's still something very much off in you, unquote. Now, off, that's a bit vague, but my main question is, how is that damaging? Okay? It's only damaging if the response to that assertion is condemnation. That, oh, because it is off in you, you deserve to be condemned. There's something wrong with you, and we should shame you and shun you. That would be damaging. But, so say I'm going to counseling because, like the anger example, that until we see a shift in my emotions, there might still be something off. Well, that'll be fine. We have no problem thinking that when it comes to that issue, because we understand we're all fallen, and we're all works in progress. So let's be consistent. Would you have the same incredulous response to counseling for something else like anger or schizophrenia or alcoholism? No. No, because we understand that the appropriate response to something still being off isn't condemnation, but compassion. And that's what people in the rebuild column are offering. Compassion, genuine care, comfort, help, assistance. This is another thing too. this is why I don't typically pay much attention to the people in the renounce column and the resist column, because look at most of them. Some are pastors, but most are just authors, theologians, just lay people who just happen to get a good book deal. Very few of them are actually counselors who are getting in the dirt with people and helping them work through these issues. I'm going to listen more to the people like Stephen Black or Andrew Comiskey or Joe Dallas and Cy Rogers and so many other people in the rebuild column who actually are doing the work. Joe Nicolosi, Carolyn Pila, Mike Davidson, the ones that I know who are providing actual professional counseling to people, and they're seeing the benefits. Those are the people I'm going to pay attention to. So I don't really pay much mind to these others, but when they are gaining popularity and they're using that platform to attack those of us who are doing good work, that's when I'm going to start speaking up, and that's why I've been doing this series.
And you can't live out a faithful life towards Jesus fully until that's repaired. Is that?
Yeah, and it lacks a biblical anthropology of people and a biblical ecclesiology.
Again, he says things like, quote, "You can't live out a faithful life to Jesus fully until that's repaired." Again, I hope you can see, that's a straw man.
At one point, John Polk, he says in the movie, like, he literally says the entire Christian church is based on being married and having a family.
Right, I remember that.
And that right there, that's like, I thought it was based on Jesus and his resurrection and like apprenticing under his way and living it out here on earth.
Right.
But no, because that's the not even implicit message. It's oftentimes the explicit message that unless you have kids and get married, like, you aren't really walking with Jesus. There's something wrong with you. Never mind that Jesus never got married and Paul wasn't married.
Right. You know what's interesting with that? Because when he said that, I was like 100%, and I've said this many, many times on the podcast and my writing and stuff, just this idolatry of marriage that exists in the church. I
also find it funny that they bring up what John Polk said in the documentary about Christianity being all about marriage. And so they use this as an opportunity to talk about how the church, the modern church, idolizes marriage. I talked about this some already in part 1, but I do want to acknowledge a little bit that what they might be picking up on is a bit of an indictment against big evangelical churches for promoting the rule of marriage without promoting or fully explaining the reason for that rule. The great, beautiful, redemptive, ecstatic plan that God has for our sexuality and marriage. The bride and Christ. And I think that so many of our mainstream or our Protestant churches have been missing that. And I have to say we should own that that's part of the problem. We've not been explaining the true purpose of marriage, the ultimate purpose, to be an icon of the heavenly marriage. And so we just promote as a rule, but we don't explain all the reasons for the rule. We're giving the ethic without the ethos. And so people like Preston see the promotion of marriage as idolatry and want to discard it as a norm. They're like, well, look, Paul didn't say everyone should be married, and so they'll almost treat it like marriage isn't that important. And they're missing that a symbolic perspective teaches that marriage is an icon, not an idol. Now, the funny thing is, he recently had on Darren Belusek, and he realized the sacramentality of marriage. That's what Darren Belusek's book is all about. He makes a case against gay marriage by explaining the deeper meaning of what marriage is itself. And he gets into, I don't know if he uses the term, but he gets into the theology of the body. And when Preston was interviewing him, he said, man, I wish I could rewrite my chapter in my book about marriage. I would definitely include the insights I gained from your book. So, Preston, I hope you will reconsider some of the words you're saying about the idolatry of marriage and see that traditional historic churches and who are being faithful to the historic sexual ethic of the church, we're not idolizing marriage. We are treating it as the icon that it is. But sometimes, because we are not presenting the rule of marriage with the reason for it, it does come off as if we're idolizing it. I can understand why there might be some thought about that.
Anyway, yeah, it's not a Christian film. So yeah, what are some positive? Maybe sum up, because you've already kind of hit on some of them.
Yeah. Well, there's two that come to mind instantly. I know that the gentleman, I almost said the character, this is a documentary, the gentleman Jeffrey, that kind of anti-trans person that the movie bookends itself with.
Right.
He seemed to have a really genuine, kind, and tender heart towards people. And like, I mean, my wife and I were watching it, and she was just like, "Oh, I love him. I want to be his friend." And I'm like, and they could have picked a crazy person, because they're out there, and they could have picked like a crazy, mean-spirited person, and he just was
really. Who of the remaining leaders that were part of Exodus or are still part of Restored Hope Network or the Changed Movement or Freedom March, who's crazy and mean? Stephen Black is probably the most outspoken of the ex-gay ministers out there, but what can you hold against him? That he's passionate and bold? Like, that he's not winsome? Like, really, so who's crazy and mean? I wonder if really you're not talking about the actual ministers and counselors in this field, but you're talking about other just pastors and talking heads that are out there who represent the theology within our side or the traditional side of within Christianity, but they're not actually ministers in this field. They don't actually counsel people with this issue. And so there are some people that maybe agree with us theologically or ideologically, but they're not really representatives of us because they're not the ones doing the work. So I think what you're indicating there is a conflation between different leaders in the church who don't speak so tactfully about homosexuality and conflating that with the actual counselors helping people with this issue.
Do you think they represented the ex-gay movement well, from what you know about it? I don't know enough. I mean, I got into this conversation literally the year Exodus closed down. I had heard about Exodus before, but I did not live through it all, you know. So and because my ministry has been separated from that kind of approach, I don't know. All I know is loads of stories from my friends that they're telling me, you know, which are some are better than others. Most of them are pretty eerie.
Yeah.
All right, once again, you're getting commentary from people like Preston and Tony who have no background in Exodus, who had no experience with the ministries that they're criticizing. And to see them then throw these ministries under the bus is just a travesty.
I think they, honestly, Preston, I think they were more charitable than they needed to be.
Wow.
They really were. I think all of them at the end of the movie said, these people think they're helping people. They think they're doing the right thing. And they didn't call a single one of them a villain. Like, and they could have taken shots at John Polk's ex-wife, like, because she hasn't always had the most helpful perspective on this stuff either. And so, like, but they didn't. Like, they really just. So I feel like if I were making this movie, I probably would have been more critical.
Tony's saying the documentary Pray Away was more charitable than it needed to be. And they actually go and say Ann Paulk hasn't always been the most helpful when it comes to this stuff. That is ridiculous. That is just plain slander. You should really be ashamed of yourselves for making that sort of statement. And yet, I don't see Ann Paulk on your channel. I don't see you doing interviews with her. So why don't you get her on your show? Find out her perspective. I mean, or you could just watch her commentary that she did on Pray Away. But really, what has she done or said that is not helpful? She has maintained the original mission of Exodus and restore the integrity of this field by weeding out different ones or gatekeeping, so some ministries that would do the harmful approaches aren't part of Restored Hope Network. So please, give me a quote. What has she said that is not helpful? And see, Preston's smiling when he says that. I'm like, it's not a good look, man. Even Tony's story doesn't match any Exodus ministry story that's out there. How can he speak authoritatively on Exodus? If it was up to him, he would have attacked fellow believers even more than the world, because he says that the film was more charitable than they needed to be. That's insane.
You know, like, I don't know if you noticed this in the movie, but I definitely noticed this with people who I had met, who claimed to be like ex-gay and fixed. And there's almost like this, like, dead eyes, like just this lifeless expression behind their face that just isn't full of life. Like something in them is dead, that maybe shouldn't be dead.
You mean this look? And also, who claims to be fixed? Okay, that is... Show me someone's testimony who says that. I mean, are you just referring to people who say that they're free from homosexuality, or that they've experienced some degree of change? Like, if you're lumping everyone together with the ex-gays in this documentary, that's an audacious thing to say. I mean, we already know John Paulk was lying. In Ann Paulk's commentary, she says that she's since that time that she was married to John, she's learned more about nonverbal communication, and she looks back at that footage that was in the documentary, and she's like, wow, now I see signs there that he was lying. So yeah, there's a certain look he has that to tell that he was lying. And
every person like that, especially John Polk, and I think the guy's name was Randy, who was running it near the end. When you see them get up there and speak, like, they just look lifeless. And the one guy who didn't look lifeless ended up being the who, once he heard people's stories, was like, yeah, we got to shut this thing down. Mm-hmm. So that, to me, like, that speaks to something of, again, like a bad biblical anthropology, that like this, maybe it wasn't God's design that everybody function in this way.
But really, you're going to say that about everyone who says they're free from homosexuality, or they've experienced change? Really? It really makes you think you haven't met that many people. Because look at the people that are at the Freedom March. Look at the people in the change movement. Do they have that dead stare that you're talking about? No. Give me a break. And then he suggests that perhaps heterosexuality is not God's standard for all people. That's a strange thing to say, since on one hand you're saying you promote the historic sexual Christian ethic that allows for sex and marriage only between a husband and wife, but then you're going to say that heterosexuality might not be the standard for all people. When you say heterosexuality, are you just meaning the attractions, or are you talking about all of the aspects of sexual orientation? The attractions, the identity, the behavior, the relationships? Okay, you might need to clarify that one.
It seems biblical and rational to me to believe that, like, there can be such a thing as mixed orientation marriages, or, like, shocker, like, maybe the Lord really just does want some people to be single, and that's okay. And that's right. a blessing in and of itself with its own set of challenges. But, like, why do you think Paul contends against marriage? Like, in 1 Corinthians 7, please don't get married. I would rather you didn't. Like, we just don't have an idea for that in the American church.
Yeah.
Notice he thinks that mixed orientation marriages are biblical. See, these are the weird muddied waters we get into when you look at same-sex attraction as a stable trait, and you refuse to accept the possibility of our sexual integrity and wholeness being restored. You end up normalizing consequences of our fall.
A lot going in, expectations. So, I thought it seemed to accurately portray what many of my friends have told me about some of these ministries. And again, I felt like it was more mild than some of the things I heard. I mean, I've heard some downright disturbing things that have gone on. I can't even repeat them because I think the people who told me were under oath not to repeat what goes on, which tells you that that's like, wow, why? So the stuff that even when they showed like a Joseph Nicolosi in counseling sessions and stuff, even that, I'm like, and there were some extended kind of like recordings of counseling sessions, and I was like, that doesn't seem that bad. And
that was my thought too.
really,
Yeah.
okay, I'm hesitating how I say it because I'm like, people, I don't want to open a wound to somebody who's gone through those sessions and say, no, it's actually horrible. You have no clue. So I don't want to diminish people, but based on, I don't see you that way. How does it feel that I still love you even though you feel broken or something like that? I'm like, that could be a lot worse. I don't know if I'd take that exact approach.
And Preston hints that the documentary seemed accurate to what others have told him goes on in ex-gay ministry, but he's not allowed to say. It's like, look at all the vagueness they use. They keep dropping hints that, ex-gay ministry or reparative therapy or counseling for SSA is really bad, but they're not really saying what it is. What is so bad about it? But he'll admit, even what they showed of Joseph Nicolosi was not bad. But look at the way he hesitates to say it, because he doesn't want to offend people who are unhappy with the help they got. He's careful to not offend haters, but he'll happily attack or not care about offending the many people who have been helped by ex-gay ministry and counseling for SSA. And of course he has to throw in there a little statement that, well, I wouldn't take Nicolosi's approach. Like, you gotta do that. You gotta pay your dues to the anti-therapy ideology. But why? Why not? I mean, could just be because you're not a therapist and you don't know enough about what goes into his approach. Is there some more informed perspective if you were a therapist, why you wouldn't take his approach? I mean, I'm open to hearing it because his approach isn't the only one out there as well. There are other people within the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice who don't use reparative therapy or reintegrative therapy. They use, say, narrative therapy or content behavioral therapy. Is that what you're saying? You would use a different one of those approaches? Or is it something else you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I can say some stuff that we did in conversion therapy that was like, well, I mean,
yeah, whatever you want to share, dude. I mean, I don't want to.
At this point, whatever. Like, I've shared a lot. I had the one of my counselors. I had a couple, and one of them would have me, like, every time I started having a like lustful or sexual thought towards someone of the same sex, they wanted me to try and imagine that every time I engage one of those thoughts, I'm doing another whip on Christ's body. Like, and then imagine that I have a whip in my hand and that I'm lashing his body up. And like stuff like that. So like,
finally, Tony shares what was so traumatic and harmful about one of the counseling experiences he had. Because he saw a couple different counselors. Okay? And one definitely was using a shaming technique that no one in Restored Hope Network, I don't know about some of the Exodus ministries. Yeah, at the height of Exodus, there was like 120 different ministries. Okay? There's bound to be some in there that were not practicing sound, ethical counseling techniques. Okay? And mostly, they were probably lay counselors, self-help groups, stuff like that. Not actual therapists trained in sound counseling approaches. So that's what this sounds like. This sounds like some sort of pastoral counselor or a lay Christian counselor, someone not adequately trained and definitely using more of a shaming and guilt-based approach. And that's definitely not a common experience. I would never think to tell someone, every time you sin, every time you look at gay porn, imagine another whip going across Jesus' back. What good would that do them? They already have enough guilt and shame. I'm not going to add to it. No counselor I know would do that.
They give that, like, kids who go through conversion therapy are 2 times as likely to attempt suicide.
Yeah.
And that feels like an awfully weird footnote to put at the end of your movie. It feels like you should explore that a little more.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought that percentage would have been higher. That's almost like they probably could have found, because you know how stats are. There's always a study that somewhere. So I thought they would have said like 10 times higher or something, but that's yeah. I haven't done. I don't know the exact numbers on that, but
all right, this part was just outrageous. Preston actually thought that the rate of suicidality among youth who did SOCE would be 10 times higher. Like, this coming from the guy who admits he doesn't know much about Exodus. And he's supposed to be well-researched. Come on, man, think through this a bit more. And do a little research before you make a statement like that, or have some assumption in your head that you just revealed. What about this? Assuming that the statistic is true, it doesn't prove causation. Okay, and that's not a cop-out. Because an alternative is that it shows people who are more disturbed are more likely to seek help for their same-sex attraction. Did you ever consider that as an explanation? Not that the same-sex attraction counseling caused the suicidality or increased it, but rather that these individuals who are more prone to suicidality are the ones more likely to try to get counseling for the same-sex attraction. In fact, that seems to be more likely the answer, because some more recent research has shown when you look at the timetables, those who are suicidal and also did counseling for SSA experienced most of their suicidality prior to the therapy, showing that the therapy actually helped reduce the suicidality. So, perhaps use a little more critical thinking when it comes to some of these outrageous claims posted by this documentary that clearly has an agenda to outlaw counseling for this issue.
That part towards the end when Julie was, she's in the middle of writing a book, and she was reading to her I think they were already married at that time, her wife, reading about her past when she was self-harming, like burning red hot quarters into her flesh.
Yeah.
Because she was so angry at how sinful she was for simply experiencing same-sex attraction, that this was not going away. And as she said, and I know this from Julie, she was a good kid, happy, did not get into trouble. Like, she was a good Christian teen. Then to hear her describe how much she hated her physical body and was burning quarters into it as sort of this self-atoning affliction because her SSA was not going away. That, I don't know anybody, and even if there's people that are pro reparative therapy, or maybe the kind of neo versions of it today, I'm sure there's some listening, like, hopefully, and you probably hate most of this podcast, but hopefully there are some scenes like that where you can, I don't know anybody that can listen to that and not be moved, in a healthy way. Like, wow, that's whatever's causing somebody to do that, that's not good.
Definitely. Agreed. But are we certain that it's the counseling she's receiving that is causing her to self-harm? Okay, we already know that she experienced a rape. The documentary wasn't clear when she was doing the self-harm. Was it before or after the rape that she experienced? We also weren't given a whole lot of insight about her upbringing, but there are some hints dropped that show that her upbringing, or her family or parents, seem to be particularly strict. Should the counselors be blamed for her upbringing? That may have been what caused her or motivated her to go into the counseling, but might also be what was increasing her distress.
But we don't really get honest about temptations in church. I think I just sort of assume most people are tempted by things that they would never want anyone to know they're tempted by. But I wonder if that's where the Catholics get it right with the practice of confession. I think I had that thought all the time growing up. Like, if I could just talk to somebody who wasn't allowed to tell other people and wasn't allowed to follow up with me about it, but could just speak the forgiveness of Christ over me, that would have been life changing as a kid. And yeah, and you hear John, his story was tragic to me, of him having to lie that he wasn't even tempted by sexuality. That he said, if I were to say, because he said, I was happy, I was married, I had kids, but if I told him I was tempted by this, I would have lost everything. And it's maybe if he were allowed to say he was tempted by it, he wouldn't have lost everything. He wouldn't have gone to that nightclub. And
do you think that's where some of the strictness and lies of, and I'll just say some or many branches of the ex-gay narrative that he went through, were Do you think that has caused some of these people to just kind of totally jump ship and leave their families and go back to living out their orientation? Because that if you're not even allowed to say no, I still wrestle with this absolutely every day. I have to bring it to the cross, and sometimes I mess up, and I need the church to come around me and help me. The fact that you don't even have that kind of outlet, I just envision this pressure cooker that's gonna blow at some point.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, how can it not?
And this conversation they just had here really just shows how little they know about the ex-gay ministries. All the therapists I know in this field are very upfront. They're very open about their own struggles. I mean, even Cy Rogers would say, yeah, I still experience same-sex attraction. Andrew Comiskey admits when he still has same-sex attraction. Ann Paulk, John Paulk's wife, in the same interview on, I think, Jerry Springer, where he said he doesn't experience any temptations anymore. They don't show this in a documentary, but she said, yes, I do occasionally still experience the temptations, same-sex attractions. Now, of course, today she would say, yeah, sure, sometimes, but they're so minimal. Her change has just progressed so much, her healing's progressed so much that they're really just like inconsequential. And that's more what I hear, is that those who continue on the path, that they're not like struggling, they're not white-knuckling it. As they just grow in their healing, they might still experience same-sex attraction at times, but it's just gotten to be inconsequential and not nearly as distressing as it was before. So they're thinking that these ministries were making us that John Paulk would have lost everything if he was honest. No. John thought he would have lost everything if he was honest. Anne was honest. Andrew Comiskey is honest. Like, all the counselors, they're honest. Some actually have experienced radical change. But they're honest about whether or not they do. I mean, going back to the beginning, you can read Frank Worthen's book, Steps Out of Homosexuality. He's honest there about his continued struggles. And Preston's got the nerve to say that they didn't have an outlet to be honest? No, some people just refuse to be honest because of their own guilt or their own shame, but it's not because it's being put on them by the ministries that they're involved in. Get to know these actual ministries. What you'll find is they're the most welcoming communities. What I do with my group was try to create a space where it's open and safe to be genuine and authentic. And I'm not an exception to the norm. All I'm doing is doing exactly what I learned at the Exodus ministry I used to be a part of. Heck, go to a Living Waters training. Preston, please, I encourage you, take a week. Go to a week-long Living Waters training and experience what actually happens at these ministries. You won't find a more transparent group of people.
And the fact that he and the founder, Michael Bussey, are both actively gay in relationships or marriages, not involved with church, says a lot about how we know how to handle people's temptations.
So this is a conclusion based off ignoring all the people who've been helped by ex-gay ministry.
Even that's with the film. They could have really taken a shot at the church by making that more front and center, that this is what Christianity does, and now they're free and happy that they left religion. But they didn't. It seems like they had that opportunity, and didn't take it. They didn't bring in kind of their faith journey through it all.
That's because they're not stupid. You don't attack Christianity as a whole, at least not yet. You attack a straw man of a cardinal doctrine and a subset of pastoral care or counseling for people within Christianity. You attack that. Get them to vilify that. You chip away at Christianity one doctrine at a time. You're not going to attack Christianity as a whole. These producers aren't idiots. They may be mockers and fools in the sight of God, but they're not stupid. They got a strategy in mind. Heck, watch my video on the gay agenda. You'll get what I'm talking about.
I have a question. This is kind of a bridge question between the pros and the cons, so we can kind of start thinking about the cons. when it comes to reparative therapy, and this is something, and I hate our culture that you're not even allowed to kind of talk out loud or ask questions for fear of, this kind of self-censoring, somebody might not like what you're implying or whatever. But here's my, and I basically I can care less about all that. Are some aspects of what goes on in so-called reparative therapy helpful? Here's my question. I think loads of people, gay, straight, bi, asexual, whatever, could use a good dose of dealing with stuff in the past that hasn't been dealt with, examining areas of trauma that's been calloused over, especially, 20 to 30% of females have been sexually abused. A large percentage have not dealt with that in a healthy way. I think 10 to 20% of males, have been sexually abused. Why are teen anxiety rates, depression rates, suicide rates off the chart? My question is, I know reparative therapy gets kind of critiqued of, unearthing all this, something in the past, and I get that. I disagree with the motivation that if you're same-sex attracted, it must be linked to something in the past. But my question is, it could be, or could there not be? And let me reframe that. I'm not saying that that's ever the sole cause, but I agree with the American Psychological Association that sexual orientation is a complex blend of nature and nurture. It's hard to unravel that. There's probably always some biological propensity that maybe has been nurtured by some environmental thing, and it's impossible to sort all that out. And that's something that virtually everybody agrees on today, complex blend of both. It just seems like whatever your story, it can be good to heal from past trauma or different parental relationships or whatever. Maybe you did have a domineering dad or domineering mom and absent. I just don't want to throw the entire baby out with the bathwater because, but that's what reparative therapy people do,
Is the light turning on? Yes, Preston. Why not invite on an actual reintegrative therapist like Joe Nicolosi Jr.? Try it out. Find out what actually happens in reintegrative therapy, or formerly reparative therapy. Please, we don't mind being asked what we actually do. We have nothing to hide.
You know what I'm asking, and what are your thoughts on that? And how do we go about that without repeating the past of wrong-headed ex-gay stuff?
Well, I think the redemptive parts of reparative therapy are when you remove the word reparative. It's just therapy.
Okay.
And to me, that's there's okay. I would be a fool to say that maybe I wouldn't be a fool to say this, but it doesn't seem like that much of a stretch for me to be like, well, yeah, my mom was a drug addict from the time I was 12 until I was 20 when she died of an overdose. So maybe, and then I had one girlfriend who needed help, literally needed psychological help, in all that. And we were together for 3 years. And so it doesn't seem like that much of a stretch to be that there's not the most positive feminine voices in Tony's life. And right. My dad is insanely tender and nurturing and real hands, man, construction worker my whole life, but kisses and hugs and I love yous all the time. And so he was always the safest place in the world for me. So I could see somebody spinning, and I've heard it, people spinning my story to say, well, that's why you feel that way, Tony. And my point is I don't really care about why, because it doesn't change the fact that it is what it is. And to insist that somebody has to, or even can on their own will, just remove this, or that it is God's will for that to be taken away, for sure. I'm not saying that God can't, or it doesn't even occasionally. I don't think I've ever heard a story where I wasn't suspicious. But he can, he can, and he can do whatever he wants. He's a free God. But I just, that's where I'm I think that I think everybody should do therapy. I think everybody should figure out the thing beneath the thing and why they do what they do. But I don't therapy with the intent of fixing a specific issue,
Yeah.
regardless of the issue. Like, therapy can't have a preferred outcome, or else it won't work.
That's it. That's exactly what I was. That's as I was even thinking, formulating my question. It's the difference is it's healing from all this past stuff, which might be legitimate, so that you're no longer attracted to the same sex. And if that outcome isn't achieved, then you haven't truly healed. And that's basically the 100%. Underlying problem. Okay.
And Tony thinks that the redemptive part is when you just call it therapy. Well, we don't all call it reparative therapy or reintegrative therapy. Like I said, there are multiple therapeutic approaches that can be used to help people with unwanted same-sex attraction. So yes, some do just call it therapy. Okay? But there's a reason why we give it a name, and it's helpful to do that. Because if I had unwanted same-sex attraction, I'm going to want to find a therapist who's going to actually provide the help that I'm looking for. And if I just look up psychology today and find a therapist and it says they deal with LGBT issues, most likely I'm going to get stuck with a gay affirmative therapist who's going to steer me in the opposite direction of where I want to go. But if I find someone who says, hey, I'm certified in reintegrative therapy, an approved member of the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice, I'm like, okay, that's someone who's offering the help that I'm looking for, and I can trust that. So yeah, it's kind of important for us to be able to make a distinction so that people looking for the help that we're offering can actually find it. Now you can say, well, maybe we shouldn't try to do counseling that has the stated agenda of changing the attractions. Sure, maybe, but some people just want to have the opportunity to explore their heterosexual potential. And you know what? Why not? Why not? The verdict is still out. Or is it? Carolyn Pila and Phil Sutton just published an article of a longitudinal study done of Nicolosi's clients that showed two things. Well-being increased as they did the therapy, and their sexual attraction changed on a continuum toward heterosexuality. So not only are we seeing that there's now published evidence of the effectiveness of working on the underlying traumas and addictions using a reintegrative therapy approach. So it's not just effective, but it's also beneficial, and it's not harmful. So why not just allow people to get the therapy that matches their own values and goals? And can you really generalize that rule about therapy not having preferred outcomes? Therapy needs goals to be effective, at least in general. Unless you want to do psychoanalysis 3 times a week for 20 years of your life. Okay, this just shows that these guys are talking out of ignorance of actual therapy. Sorry, but that's the truth. Now, a good therapist, though, helps give their clients realistic expectations. They don't make outrageous claims and promises or guarantees. And we teach that if the same-sex attraction does change, it's only as a byproduct of other issues being resolved. Okay, that's setting the stage more appropriately.
If they had interviewed Jackie Hill Perry or David Bennett or you, and like presented like advocates of side B LGBTQ Christians, like, to me it would have been a documentary worth really wrestling with, like it was really looking to dive deep into what are the options for queer Christians.
Here he's lumping in Jackie Hill Perry with the side B Christians, and I've looked. I can't find any evidence of her referring to herself as queer. But I can see, because of the way she talks about same-sex attraction as being pretty much a stable thing, I can see why they might start to put her in their column, and I mentioned that in my last video. But I still can't find an explicit statement from her where she says that she's a gay Christian or a queer Christian. So you might want to be careful with how you're categorizing her without her permission.
Yeah. But they can ask these really articulate queer, non-affirming Christians like to talk about their worldviews and why they don't embrace a secular sexual ethic. They ask the guy who's going to use terms like the schools want to get your kids and they want to chop up your kids' genitals and somebody who's not going to have the most nuanced, articulated, like.
Well, he ain't wrong. Check out my video about the gay agenda is coming for your children. Okay? They do want to groom children into a trans cult and the LGBT agenda.
I want to say this. This ties in with Jeffrey. Is they have scenes with like Julie and Michael Bussey talking about how reparative therapy is like really big and large and good today, and like it's a huge thing. That's how they kind of end the movie. And you go to their example of this, Jeffrey's, and he's got like 30 people like at his marches, and it's like he's freaking out that his Facebook post has 3,000 likes, and what's going on here? Like,
so that's my other question is it that big?
Tragic and bad, and the fact that it still happens is I think a problem, but that doesn't mean that it's still huge and vibrant and thriving, which is I think the exact terms that one of the interviewees said at the end, is that it's a thriving movement still.
Okay, I do appreciate that they're acknowledging the reality that ex-gay ministries or counselors who help people with unwanted same-sex attraction are few and far between. But I also get the sense that they're talking about this in a bit of a mocking tone. I might be wrong, but I am getting a bit of that impression. But of course they have to throw in this, that when it happens, it is wrong, but it's not that big a thing. Like, you haven't really made your case why it's wrong yet. But you're definitely throwing us on a bus. I don't appreciate that.
Conversion therapy is rooted in a subtle form of the prosperity gospel. It's rooted in this idea of a transactional God, where if I do this, God will honor, and he has to honor his end of the transaction. So
I already talked about this in my last video, about the whole straw man argument that conversion therapy is the prosperity gospel.
Pentecostal churches in America, as Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry in Redding, California, they have a pretty big ex-gay ministry over there.
Okay. That was my next question. Yeah.
What's that?
That was my next question. Is Bethel? Because I know they have. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was one of the resources that was utilized for me when I was not to name names, like, and I will say, while it is definitely conversion therapy, that's not where I got the whipping Christ's body every time you like have a lustful thought. Okay. It was from just for anybody, because Bethel's kind of cheap shots. It's easy to take shots at them, but
one of the places that Tony went was Bethel's ministry, Equipped to Love, that is run by Ken Williams and Elizabeth Woning, and there's a third person as well, I forget his name. And so I appreciate him pointing out that this was not the one that used the shaming technique, because I do have a lot of respect for the work that Equipped to Love is doing. But he still lumps it together. He still says, well, it's all conversion therapy.
So it's not change. So and this is another, this kind of leads into another question I have, is just the language of change, transformation, and my interactions. And I hope, so those of you who are listening that are advocates of maybe change or Bethel or reparative therapy, it's the language of change and transformation that I think is unhelpful, because people will ask me, well, Preston, don't you believe God can change people? And it's a very loaded question. What am I supposed to say? No. Yeah. But to reduce the complexity and tensions within this issue to don't you believe God can change people, I think misses so much. If people are going to use the language of change and transformation, which are biblical concepts and terms even, you need to be incredibly precise on what exactly you're talking about. Yeah. Do I believe God can make a 5'4" man 6'4"? Yes, absolutely. Is that the typical way in which God acts? Not really. Or even take, a disability or something, somebody that had his arm lost in an accident. Can God cause that arm to grow back? 100% without blinking an eye, I would say, yes, God has that ability. Is that the way God typically acts? In my anecdotal experience with one-armed people, no. It's not the typical way. So I would map this conversation on that for whatever reason. This has not been the typical way in which God has responded in kindness to people who are attracted to the same sex.
All right, this is what I was saying before. Preston is comparing SOCE therapy to as if trying to hope God will change a disability. That's just not what God does. Sure, God can do everything, but it's just not something that God does. Preston, I agree. We do need to be more clear about what we're talking about when we say that change is possible. Now, ironically, the ones who are really promoting, at least according to Ann Palk, promoting the campaign of saying change is possible were the final two leaders of Exodus, Randy Thomas and Alan Chambers, the ones who ended up shutting the whole thing down and changing their whole view on everything and ended up actually probably hurting more people. So they were kind of being irresponsible in the way that they presented the idea of change. So in reality, when we're talking about change, we're meaning it in a more holistic way. Because we understand that sexual orientation is more than just your attractions. That there's dimensions to sexual orientation. Your identity, your self-concept, your attractions and arousal, your behavior, and your relationships. We see all of those as encompassing what everyone else just calls sexual orientation. And when everyone else talks about sexual orientation, they're just talking about your attractions. Well, that's too simplistic. People are more complex than that. So when we talk about change, we're talking about change within all of those dimensions and to different degrees. We understand that change occurs on a continuum. So we don't promise a degree of change in any particular area. We understand that this is not an easy process. But I really take issue with your comparison of God bringing healing or change in someone's life in this area and comparing that to God changing someone who is missing a limb. This contradicts what you were saying earlier when you agreed with the APA that most likely there are multiple causes, a mixture of nature and nurture, which, mind you, there's no actual solid evidence of a gay gene. So they're still hoping that there will be more of a nature cause. But the reality is we're finding more and more that that's not the case. So our experience has been that it sure seems like there's more nurture. Sorry. That's the reality that we see when we're actually working with people. But we acknowledge that there's multiple causes. But the way you're talking about the change process or the possibility of change is as if it's only a biological thing. So which is it? Are there multiple causes? A mixture of nature and nurture? If it is a mixture of nature and nurture, why not be open to the possibility that we can address the nurture causes and see what the result could be? At least give the people some reasonable outlet for exploring that possibility. Your comparison to physical illnesses or injuries seems to reveal your own presupposition that this is more biological, even though earlier you were saying that it's multifactorial and causal.
Most importantly, though, apart from even that, most importantly is I absolutely, fundamentally, theologically do not think that it is necessary for faithfulness. And that, to me, that's where the shame, the God hates me, the self-harm, isn't that where it comes in? Is like God is less pleased with me as long as I am still wrestling with this temptation.
Yeah,
and that to me is really destructive when you either explicitly or implicitly give that impression that until you do not have this temptation anymore, something is still off in your spirituality, and God's still kind of like, well, I mean, I still love you, but, you know, that kind of view of God, which is destructive.
That's the crux of the matter to him. And yet the crux of the matter to him is one big straw man. Because none of the ex-gay ministries, none of the ministries or counselors in the Rebuild column teach that at all. We are not saying that you must experience change in your attractions in order to be faithful as a Christian. We are not shaming people. So if you would just stop using that big straw man, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, and then you get to the point in the documentary where you're seeing Exodus International working at the Republican National Convention and them being elevated to places of significant influence and authority. And then you start seeing this trend that's really vibrant in the American church, which is like, if you go to a church and like again, Pentecostals, like altar calls, like prayers, signs and wonders, like I am all for that. Like, but there is a version of that that is exploiting people's desperations as a way of gaining your own influence and power. And like you see Exodus International clearly doing that, and they're even saying that that's what we were doing because it was like a financially beneficial arrangement. And bringing Joseph Nicolosi in there and like all that kind of stuff. They were helping each other sell products.
And they have the audacity to say that Exodus exploited people's desperations in order to gain power. I don't think Exodus ever got that powerful. Okay, this is just plain slander.
I'm like, I'm 2 seconds in, and I have massive problems with how they're framing this. But what it's common is the correlation between sexual orientation change efforts and gender identity change efforts. These are two very, very different things. And if anybody's interested, I'm doing a long blog series addressing the many differences between sexual orientation change efforts and so-called, I'll use that phrase, gender identity change efforts. And, you know, they have the two lines, you know, this is they define sexual orientation and gender identity change, which their definition applies to sexual orientation change, not gender identity change. And then they say every major medical industry has deemed this harmful or whatever. And again, that applies to sexual orientation change efforts, not so-called gender identity. What's gender identity change? Well, that's a massive conversation. I mean, you have the example they give is a biological male who used to identify as female, and then he came to the realization he's actually male. That's different than somebody actually being attracted to the same sex. Factually, ontologically, they are that. Yeah. And trying to change them into something that they aren't. For good or for ill, whatever, but that's on just categorically that is different than so-called gender identity. You know, one person's gender identity change efforts is another person's helping somebody to live in their body without having significant dysphoria over the biological sex that they factually are. Would be another.
Now, this part is really interesting. All right, it really bothers Preston that Pray Away and really most of the therapy bans, all this anti-therapy propaganda that's out there and efforts, activism, is conflating SOCE with gender identity change efforts. It really bothers him because it says that someone who desists in a transgender identity is really just realizing their true sex. And that's different from SOCE. But actually, I would say, no, it's not. Now, within the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice, there is a bit of debate about whether or not it's necessary to pathologize the same-sex attraction. But from a natural law perspective, we have to ask ourselves, what is normative? What is normal? And normality is that which functions according to its design. So no, you can't have it both ways. You can't base gender identity off biological reality, but then base sexual orientation off the subjective self-concept and feelings of homosexuality. A gay identity is being based off feelings in the same way that a transgender identity is based off feelings. And both of them are divergent from your own biology. Because to believe that you're meant to engage in sex and a marital union with someone of the same sex is to deny that your body is meant to be with the opposite sex. That's just a biological reality. Not to mention a spiritual reality. That male and female were meant to be together as an icon of Christ and the church. So what makes homosexuality wrong ultimately is that it's symbolic confusion. It does not uphold and match the symbol of what sex is all about, what marriage is all about.
What do you do when you have someone like a John Polk or Michael Bussey who gets married and realizes it doesn't make them straight?
Yeah, that's a good question. and I'm not sure I have a tailored answer. Are you saying they were under the impression that getting married would make them straight?
Yeah, that was kind of their.
So I would, I would 100% disagree with that getting married will make you straight. So I would say that's really sad and unfortunate that the person was under that impression. So I would help them maybe deal with that. I'm not a psychologist. Okay, I would help them. To understand that I'm so sorry, but you were fed a wrong-headed message that this is going to make you straight.
Well, we don't teach that. We don't teach that marriage will make you straight. We look at marriage as a possibility for some people, as part of their own journey, and if God calls them to marriage and not calls them to celibacy. But it does not necessarily make you straight. A lot of our clients are people who are already married, and they're realizing, I still have these same-sex attractions. I want to work through this. So we don't look at marriage as a cure. Now, doesn't mean that we say that you can only marry once you're fully attracted only to the opposite sex. So people marry with some degree of same-sex attraction. We understand that. I usually don't recommend that they pursue that until they've gained a significant degree of change already. Because I wouldn't want them to have this sort of expectation that the marriage will fix the remainder of their problem for them. Okay? I don't promote that as a marriage is not a therapeutic intervention. Okay? We don't teach that.
And the underlying assumption again is that straightness is more holy than non-straightness, which, can I get a shout out from all those straight people out there who struggle with porn and
ultimately, this last segment here really shows how they are marginalizing straightness in order to put it on equal playing field as same-sex attraction. So on one hand, you will say that no, the historic sexual ethic is correct, that marriage is meant to only be between man and woman, but you're not going to acknowledge how the eroticization of the same sex is indicative of something abnormal. And so that's really where we diverge in a lot of ways. So Preston, if you're watching this, I hope you do take me up on my challenge to invite on your show, on your podcast, some of the actual leaders in the rebuild column, like Ann Palk, like Joe Dallas, and really talk not just about his new book, but about the work he does in counseling men dealing with same-sex attraction. Invite on the actual reintegrative therapists that are out there, like Joe Nicolosi Jr. or David Pickup or Robert Vazzo. Contact the Alliance for Therapy Choice. See who would be willing to do an interview. Go to our conferences. Heck, look at our conferences that are online, that have videos online. Check out the work we're actually doing. Talk to people who are actually doing the work. I mean, you can contact me, but I'm like a nobody in this field. There's some bigger names that I would love for you to speak to. So I would hope that you would speak more from a place of being well educated on this rather than continue to promote slander against fellow Christians and promote the agenda that is looking to ban our work that is actually helping people. So for everyone else watching, I hope my commentary helps you make sense of everything that you're hearing from the different voices in this conversation, and that you too keep seeking truth. And if you want to help get this message out there, share, like, comment, and hit subscribe and the bell for notifications. Until next time, God bless.